Hey there, welcome. That's Sound and Vision from David Bowie's 1977 album Low. This is the video on world building. This is the video on where do those ideas come from? And great art from Amplifier, which Abby Levins encouraged me to take a look at, which I just posted in my blog, so it's really not super relevant to what I'm doing here, but I thought I would share anyway, because why not, right? So this video is specifically for people who are thinking of writing fiction, particularly fiction in which is not set in the real world. And so you have to build the world in which you set the fiction. Now, that said, some of the things I will say are relevant for people that aren't writing science fiction, fantasy, horror, supernatural, urban fantasy, and so on. But mainly this is what this video is targeting. So if that's not your shtick, or if you're not interested in learning more about that, then this video is not going to contain a ton of information that you'll find relevant. But I will try to connect it to other things outside of those genres or art forms. But we have several students in this class who are very interested in fantasy, science fiction, speculative fiction, supernatural fiction, urban fantasy, and so on. So I figured that many of you would want to watch this. So I thought I would give just some basic primer stuff and talk about stuff a little bit. And so the first real question when it comes to world building is the question that writers get all the time, which is, where do those ideas come from? Another variation on that question is, where do you get your ideas? And you know, as someone that has heard this a lot, and I'm not even a professional writer that has written as much as, say, a John Scalzi or a Neil Gaiman or a Stephen King or a Samuel Delaney or an Orson Scott Card or Octavia Butler or Ursula K. Le Guin or even Toni Morrison, who got the idea for Beloved from a newspaper article from the Civil War era. You know, so, but I have coy responses to that question, like, where do you get your ideas from? The mothership. You know, don't you communicate regularly with the mothership, where we all come from? Or another dimension. You know, there was one time where I felt like a story completely downloaded itself into my head. I was about to go have breakfast with some friends of mine, and suddenly this whole story, it was like I was receiving a transmission. I talked with other people who have these feelings too. So it's kind of like a download from the great life spirit. Or, you know, you turn the question back around to the other person. Is, you mean you're not, your mind is not constantly flooded with ideas? You know, so, you know, there's that. So the news, current events is a great place to get ideas for fiction. So I mentioned Toni Morrison getting the idea for Beloved from an article from a newspaper in the Civil War. one of my new favorite writers, Fenderson J. Clark, wrote this story called The Secret Lives of the 9 Negro Teeth of George Washington. And it's from a historical account of George Washington buying the teeth of Negroes, is often how they were referred to at the time, right? We're talking the late 18th century. And at one point he bought a package of 9 such teeth. And so Clark wanted to figure out, where do they all come from? I made this fantastic story. It's actually pretty excellent. And if I haven't posted it in the classroom yet, I'm going to. So right now I've been reading books that have been written before our current pandemic, but that target our pandemic so well. I should have better prepared, because the first one I want to mention is now, oh yeah, it's right here. I read Song for a New Day, which is a book about a time after a future pandemic has taken place and how it would impact musical performance. If you can't gather in large concerts, then what happens to live music? And Sarah Pinkser, who wrote it, had also worked as a musician for a long time. Or may I mispronounced it? Pinsker, I think it would be pronounced. And it was really good. It was really good. In fact, I think it just won the Locus Award for best science fiction novel of the last year. So I really liked it. And also right now I'm reading, and I don't have that one handy, I'm reading Wanderers by Chuck Wendig. And this is also set at the time of the pandemic. And so it starts out with these people. So it's a high concept book, what I call a high concept book, because I can tell you the premise of it doesn't ruin the story. It starts out with what appear to be sleepwalkers. These people start apparently sleepwalking, and at first it's just a couple, but then they join the march together, and suddenly there's hundreds. And then while that's happening, a pandemic starts up as well, and it's just so full of stuff that's super relevant right now. But the ideas definitely came from, say, our divisive politics, and a lot of the things that are going on right now. So a lot of times, ideas will come from those kinds of things. Other times, you start to get ideas as you think about the world that you want to set your story in. For instance, if you want to write a fantasy where there's people that use magic, you really got to kind of come up with the rules for magic. There have to be limitations to magic. And you have to establish these rules and then adhere to them and not break them, right? Now, Tolkien used very sparing amounts of magic, and there's a lot of magic in Lord of the Rings, but mostly it wasn't at the forefront. There was the magic ring, there was Gandalf, there were a few other magical creatures like elves or magical magicians like Saruman, but we didn't see a lot of magic being performed. It's not like anybody getting a spellcasting war that we watched, right? Harry Potter, there aren't a lot of rules, but there are some rules because certain spells are established and we understand how they work. But it seems like you pretty much do anything. But there's limitations. She eventually tried to limit it. I recently read the first Mistborn book by Brandon Sanderson. Uses the burning of metal. You literally swallow metal and burn it from inside your body to create these different magical effects, and different metals have different magical effects, and the rules were very well established. So some ideas can come from just playing with that, if it's science fiction, some ideas could come from how you're going to solve the problem of interstellar travel. If you're going to do, an interstellar travel, how does it work? In Star Trek, there's a warp drive that literally warps space so that space points are closer together. They've also used wormholes, which is a shortcut around the vast expanses of space, some sort of dimensional tunnel technique, like visually, conceptually, even though it really isn't, that allows you to, take a shortcut. Hyperspace, which is what we see in Star Wars, which is, shifting into a different space where the rules of physics are different, and then coming back out of that again, and between those two, you're able to cross vaster expanses of space in our known universe because the rules are different in the hyperspace universe. Or one of my favorite is the mind, where we either project our consciousness, and so our bodies don't really leave physical reality or our planet Earth, but we project our consciousness somewhere else. Or we literally use our mind to just move ourselves or change the rules of physics or whatever the case may be. But playing with these different conventions of the type of fiction that you want to write will often generate a lot of ideas, not only toward world building, but toward the story itself. Other times, writers will talk about having a kind of a ripening idea. So I have what I call the back burner. I'll get some idea of a story that I want to do, but I don't have the whole thing. So for example, I wanted to do a story using conventions from different science fiction stories that I like. So I think I talked about this in a previous video, in which I had this story that I needed to find called God is an Iron. And the story starts out with a thief breaking into a woman's apartment, and she is hooked up to this device that sends an electrical current directly into the pleasure center of her brain. And she's in this big reclining chair with a huge water bottle next to her and a tube into her mouth, which is empty by the time he finds her. She's covered with vomit and feces everywhere because she was going to commit suicide, but she's smiling and she's like in total ecstasy because she has this electric current going into the pleasure center of her brain. And I really liked that idea. And I wanted to use part or all of it and reinvent it. And so then there was this other idea that Isaac Asimov had in a story called It's a Beautiful Day, in which you have nobody goes outside. They have these teleporter doors where you can teleport from one place to another and skip going outside because apparently it's toxic to be outside. And yet this kid discovers it's not. And so I really like that idea. And then somewhere in my mind, I had this idea that there were, in the future, there'd be like a governess nanny child supervising robot teddy bear that would be able to teach children things. It would be like a companion. But what if the programming got mixed up or flawed or damaged, and the teddy bear manages to convince the child to commit murder, murder his or her parents. And so I had all of these ideas that came from other science fiction stories that I wanted to put together in some fashion, but that's not an idea for a story, right? So they were all on the back burner. And then a thing other writers will talk about is ways that ideas will come together, right? So I had those ideas, as I'm telling you about, right? But they hadn't come together yet in a story. I didn't have a story. And I didn't want to be derivative. The idea was to borrow from those stories in such a way that I could reinvent some of that material, but tell a unique story. Reinvention is popular nowadays. A guy named Victor Lavelle reinvented a Lovecraft story, and other writers have done that too, particularly with older stories. And so the idea intrigued me. And then the pandemic happened. And suddenly I was like, well, the magic door idea, the teleporting door idea, that fits the pandemic, because that would help with physical distancing. That would help with avoiding people you know, that would help, you know, with travel. And so I started to think about that. And I started to think about, well, what if this pandemic we're living through is just the first of a series of pandemics, and living in a pandemic world is the new normal, and taking precautions is the new normal, and that we're going to have a series of pandemics because we've really messed up in our relationship with animals and wildlife, and factory meat production, and it's creating all these zoonotic diseases that hop to humans, and we have no defenses for them, because that's what coronavirus is. And watch the movie Outbreak, if you want more information. It was weirdly a prognostication of what we're currently going through, right? So suddenly these ideas came together, and I started to have a story idea, and now I've had multiple story ideas in this future world, because mine is set out about 50 years into the future, where we get a really terrible virus that we have no idea how to defend against, and that once you get it, you always are infected with it. It never goes away. So I started to play with these ideas, and so I started writing this novella about this character that finds the cure, but it's also a message from the virus. And then I set that aside because that's too long, and I'm working on a short story now. But one of the things, I'll come back to this. Okay, so the other thing about so you have a couple of concepts, right? The back burner, right? So you get some ideas, but they're not ready yet. So you kind of put them on a back burner in the back of your mind and let them simmer. Then you wait for ideas to come together. Sometimes ideas that you think will be part of separate stories actually come together, and connect in a way that you're like, oh, okay, this now something is working here, right? Other times you start writing, and so Cole, one of the students in the class, was telling me about the current story that he wrote, in which he started with one idea. He's going along. He started with one idea. And he starts to realize that idea isn't as workable as he thought. It's not really coming together, and he doesn't like the direction that it would be headed. And he gets this new idea, and so he just goes with it, and he writes that new story. You know, so don't be so married to your initial ideas that when a new idea starts to emerge, you just don't go with it, because sometimes in the process, that's where the really good ideas come from, right? And often us as writers, we're so in love with the original idea we have a hard time recognizing the other really good idea that is starting to emerge. And that's often where workshop can come in, you know, because you know, us readers will see your story and we'll be able to identify something and be like, this is really interesting, and you haven't explored it, and you really should explore that instead. And so it's really characters that are important to telling our stories. And I'm going to be talking about this more in future videos. But as an early writer, I had a seminal moment with a visiting writer at my college. And I went into her office. It was really my first creative writing experience at college. And she invited me into her office, and she asked me a question that just blew my mind. She says, how do you start to write? You know, do you think of a plot, or do you start with character? And you know, for once, I've always been pretty good at anticipating what people want as an answer, as opposed to what the truth is. But this time I told the truth. I was like, I start with a plot. And she's like, I thought so. You know, and it's easy to think of a plot. Anybody can think of a plot. What's difficult is telling stories about people and real people. And once you start to think about the people in your stories and what they want and what they're doing, and you know, what they get involved in, then the stories will just evolve naturally, right? Because the characters will take over. And I thought that was kind of a weird thing to say, that the characters these inventions of mine would take over. But if you really conceive them like real people, they will take over. And so I'm gonna bring this to a wrap here and then make some suggestions. But so when it comes to the current story that I'm working on, that I was just telling you about with the pandemic stuff, right? When I set aside the novella, because I need to do a short story for this workshop I'm doing, so I came up with an idea, still set in that same world, but in a different time period. The novella is set like 10, 15 years after the hit of that particular virus, and that's that pandemic starting. And then I came up with another idea that was set more like 5 years after the pandemic began. I started to invent the characters that are part of this family, that are presented with a very difficult ethical dilemma. I started to think about who these people are and what they want. And one character is just totally taking over. She's totally dominating the story, such that I think she'll appear ultimately in the novella and other things, because and as I start writing the dialogue and as I start writing the situations, the characters just sort of dictate what is happening, and if this sounds like a foreign thing to you, you need to invest in that and really feel your people. And then the story will sort of evolve itself. That's why often writers don't know what the ending is going to be. Because if they figure out an initial basic premise of an idea and the characters that are part of that, and really start to think about the characters as people, the characters will tell the story, like you'll be able to figure out, like if you're trying to engineer a character to go in a particular direction because it fits your idea for plot, but the character you've invented wouldn't do what you're trying to make her do or him do. Then you have to be sensitive as a writer to be like, okay, I'm going to shift my approach here. And so behind all the scenes of that is world building, because if we're writing in another world, we have to invent everything about that world. So I'll give you just like a quick feel of that, and then I want to close this down. I want this to be super long. But so in the current story I'm doing with the pandemic stuff, they've invented a whole new society. The people that are trying to keep themselves from being infected are using these magic doors to create a lockdown of this system they call being in network. It's a networked system of residences and infection-free buildings and spaces. And they change the economics of the world. And so I have to think about what that would be. Like how would things change if we had a different economic system? How would things change if we have a different government system? They abandon, so it's set in the United States, but they abandon American democracy. But it's not a dictatorship. I didn't want to do a dystopia that would just be like a Big Brother kind of a thing. So I was trying, like, what would it look like if people that had their heart in the right place take over? What would that world look like as they try to do the right thing? Kind of like Google, who said don't do evil when they formed Google. And yet a lot of people would accuse them today of doing evil, right? But even so, I don't have to totally reinvent everything, because it's set in the future, but a lot of things are the same. Whereas for a long time, I was working on a fantasy that kind of merged cyberpunk and sword and sorcery fantasy. And I'm still working on it technically. But that I have to invent everything. I have to invent, and some of this is true of the current story. We have to invent history, I have to invent language, I have to invent rules for magic. I have to invent how cyberpunk and sword and sorcery goes together. I have to draw maps. I have to invent other creatures and other races and other beings and just so many things. And so I have all kinds of different files. I have a huge file full of characters. I have a huge file full of history. I have a huge file full of stuff, like artifacts and buildings and cities. Well, I have a whole file full of cities. I have a whole computer file dedicated to magic and how it works, and so on. And for world building, you have to do as much work building the world, or more work building the world, as you do actually writing the fiction. And so I'll tell you one last thing, and then I'll be done. And I want to show you a couple of things and quit. But I have a tendency to way overwrite. I have a tendency to be so in love with these ideas that I'm cooking up in my head for how the world works that I want to just dump all this information on the reader. And that's not good at all. So one of the things that I'm really concentrating on doing in the current story is not dumping any information on the reader, you know, and writing it out completely without any contextual information. And then once I get that framework set, I'm going to go back and look at what information you absolutely need. And of course, whatever I miss, people might catch in workshop and be like, oh, I kind of like to know more about that. And then I can like plug in a little bit more information. What I'm probably ultimately going to do is write the history of how we got from today to this point 50 some years in the future, for myself, as if it's like a historical document, as if it's like a history book, and write that all out so that I have that as a reference, and maybe share it ultimately if I were to publish all these things, but not put it all in the story. But I need to know it, and have it all worked out. So I told you about the secret lives of the 9 Negro teeth of George Washington. So this is really great. I posted in the classroom this really great document written by mostly science fiction writers, called the Turkey City Lexicon. It has a lot of rules for mostly science fiction and fantasy stories. For instance, when it comes to world building, one of the best rules is this one: call a rabbit a smear. You know, it's the thing where people write a story in another world where they just rename things that are obviously, you know, that's obviously a rabbit, but in this story it's called a smear, and that's not very interesting, and it's kind of amateurish. So I referenced this when I was talking about Sarah Pinsker winning the Locus Awards. It's a magazine of science fiction and fantasy and a little bit of horror, called Locus. It's absolutely wonderful. They have an online presence. I'll put it in the notes. I subscribe to it. I love to read it. It's an expensive subscription. It costs me about $70 a year to get the print version and the digital version, but I think it's worth it. I mentioned before How to Write Science Fiction and Fantasy by Orson Scott Card, and even though I don't agree with everything that Orson Scott Card thinks about gay marriage, because he's Mormon, and they have specific feelings about LGBTQ individuals, he is a great writer, and he is a very good science fiction writer, and this is a really, really, really great book about, it's, I think, the single best book on writing science fiction and fantasy. But when I was young, I came across this book, Science Fiction Handbook Revised by L. Sprague de Camp and his wife, Catherine Crook de Camp. And it is my favorite, despite the fact that I think Orson Scott Card's book is better. But this is probably out of print. It's probably impossible to find. I bought it many, many years ago. I found it in an old like newsstand. You know how they used to have a news shop, you know, that would mostly sold newspapers and cigarettes, but also would have a big book selection, you know, and like a news agency, right? And I found it in there, you know, we're talking back in the mid or early 70s. And I've read it a couple hundred times, probably, this book. It's absolutely fabulous, but it might be very difficult to find. I'll mention it in the notes, but, you know, I don't know if you'll actually find it. But anyway, thanks for paying attention. I hope some of this is useful. Let me know, you know, write me questions. But, you know, if you want extra credit points, you're writing up a reflection for this. So I'm going to do the outro. We're back to Sound and Vision from David Bowie's 1977 album Low. Thanks for paying attention. See you around.